we will continue with the phases of the Assam movement in this final module, confrontation. The inauguration of a Congress-I government led by an Assamese Muslim, Anwara Taimur, in December 1980 marked a new phase in the Assam movement. The Taimur government, formed as a result of defections to the Congress-I from other parties, survived for only 6 months. President's rule was then imposed once again in June 1981. In January 1982, a new Congress-I government led by Keshab Gogoi came to power but survived for only 2 months. In March 1982, President's rule was imposed once again and the State Assembly, elected in 1978 under very different political conditions, was dissolved. The dissolution of the State Assembly meant that the day of reckoning in Assam was approaching because the constitution did not allow for the extension of President's rule beyond a year, and elections would have had to take place unless the constitution itself was amended. Yet, it was unlikely that an election could be held without an agreement between the movement leaders and the government. The decision to end President's rule and to form a state government in December 1980 had indicated New Delhi's decision to challenge the power capability of the movement and to back electoral institutions that reflected the demographic realities of the state. The movement's power capability lay on the streets, since it could mobilize the ethnic Assamese almost to a person, but the same power capability cannot be translated into electoral strength because of the state's ethnic diversity and transformed demographic reality. Not unexpectedly, the movement leaders greeted the state government with a call for a general strike. The government, whom the leaders of the movement refused to recognize as legitimate, had to rule with maximum police protection and minimal public visibility. The Taimur government took action against ethnic Assamese government officials who were known sympathizers of the movement, including the arrest of one of the topmost police officials of the state. In order to use coercive measures against the movement, Taimur effectively had to transform the state bureaucracy. For instance, her personal secretariat, it was reported, had only Muslim gazetted officers or executives. These measures accentuated the legitimacy crisis in the state, for the process appeared to be one of de-Assamization of the state bureaucracy, and it reinforced the fear of Assamese minoritization, the loss of Assamese hegemony to immigrants. The election of Taimur to the chief ministry of the state itself had ruptured the subtle rules of ethnic accommodation into Assam's politics. In the months following the inauguration of the Taimur ministry, there was an increase in the incidence of violence. In April 1981, one of the state's highest ranking civil servants, who was identified with measures to tighten discipline amongst state government employees, was killed in a terrorist bomb attack. There were signs of tensions in the Assamese ethnic coalition. However, there was little evidence of any significant erosion of the movement's support base in the ethnic Assamese areas of the Brahmaputra Valley. State coercion was a double-edged device. While it was expected to increase the costs of participation in the movement, it also reinforced a sense of justice of the cause, while the erosion of influence of ethnic Assamese officials reinforced the fears of Assamese minoritization. The choice of Gogoi as chief minister in Jan of 1982 was an attempt to limit the damage. Gogoi, an ethnic Assamese, was Ahom by caste, which was another potential weak link in the Assamese ethnic coalition. While his government survived for only 2 months, the period was characterized by a somewhat reduced level of coercive actions and the release of the senior ethnic Assamese police official arrested by the Taimur government. The president's rule regime that was brought in after the collapse of the Gogoi government in March 1982 once again went about the task of cleansing the administration of officials in sympathy with the movement. there was increasing use of coercion. By Jan 1983, it was reported that the capital city of Guwahati and the towns of the Brahmaputra Valley were virtually armed camps. In view of the presumed unreliability of the state police forces, paramilitary forces were brought in from the centre and from other states. On the streets of the capital city, according to an Economic and Political Weekly editorial, there was a premium in not being an Assamese because ethnic Assamese young men were likely to be arrested and beaten up. The Republic Day celebration of January 26, 1983, which was boycotted by movement supporters, turned into a blatant display of military muscle against its citizens. The 23rd round of negotiations between the government and the movement leaders took place in December 1982 amid reports that the government was determined to hold elections in Assam by March 1983. The breakdown of order. The State Assembly election of February 1983 marked the breakdown of Assam's framework of ethnic accommodation and of political order. The election was a direct challenge of the central government to the Assam movement. The election was to be held on the basis of the electoral rolls prepared in 1979, which had precipitated the Assam movement. No attempt was made to revise the rolls to incorporate the points of agreement between the movement leaders and the government, that is, to remove the names of post-1971 immigrants from the rolls. Indeed, apart from sidestepping all the thorny questions of illegal aliens that had rocked the state for 3 years, the use of a 4-year-old electoral roll was problematic since it did not include voters who had come of age during the preceding 4 years. The question in the election was not who would win, but whether there would be an election at all. The holding of the election became the focus of a contest between the Assam movement and the centre. An election with a moderate to high turnout would have weakened the movement's claims about its representativeness and its power capability. The movement leaders, as expected, called for a boycott of the elections. They portrayed the election as Assam's last struggle for survival. The East Bengali immigrants, on the other hand, had few alternatives but to display their appreciation of the centre's support for their cause by participating in the voting in large numbers. The breakdown of the framework of ethnic accommodation was complete. Voter participation mostly followed a pattern predictable from the ethnic settlement patterns. In constituencies where Bengalis were predominant, the polling was high. In Assamese strongholds, it was low. The attitude to the election, however, did not vary only across the Assamese Bengali divide. The developments of the preceding 2 years had led to fissures in the weak links of the Assamese ethnic coalition itself. Moreover, apart from the Congress I, some opposition parties also contested the election. In areas where there were significant numbers of both pro-election and anti-election ethnic subgroups, violent confrontations took place. The pattern of violence reflected the total breakdown of order. If the violence did not follow neat ethnic cleavages, it is because of the oscillating and coalitional nature of ethnic projects in Assam. The violence took place along the weak lines in ethnic coalitions. Most of the violence occurred as supporters of the elections clashed with opponents. Insofar as the attitude towards the election, which to many became Assam's last struggle for survival, defined the contours of ethnic conflict in Assam, the violence reflected the local variations in ethnic alignments. The violence took place partly because of inadequate intervention by the police. Even though there was no doubt in anyone's mind that the election would be violent, the holding of an election amidst the prevailing ethnic and political polarization was no ordinary law and order problem. Arun Shauri's investigative report revealed that the government estimated that the election could be held safely in 30 of the 126 constituencies despite ethnic Assamese opposition. In 78 constituencies, polling was expected to be between 30% and 65%, and in the rest between 1% to 30%. These estimates were probably based on calculations of settlement patterns of ethnic subgroups. The government prepared for the anticipated disruption and poll violence by mobilizing large contingents of military and police forces from the rest of the country. The estimated need for security personnel was so high that the election was staggered over 3 days to allow for the movement of security personnel. Furthermore, all intelligence warnings about potential violent ethnic conflicts in areas other than the polling stations themselves had to be ignored in order to concentrate security personnel at the polling stations. One of these was from a local police official who warned that 1,000 Assamese villagers are getting ready to attack East Bengali immigrant villages with deadly weapons. That warning, which anticipated the massacre in Nellie, that was reported widely in the international press, was filed 3 days before the massacre. According to official figures, 1,383 men, women and children were killed in that massacre. The poll boycott was quite effective in the districts of the Brahmaputra Valley. Of Assam's 126 assembly constituencies, only Congress-I candidates contested and one unopposed in 4 constituencies. In 14 constituencies, elections had to be cancelled because of the total breakdown of law and administration. In some strong ethnic Assamese constituencies, the polling was as low as 0.38%, 269 voters, sometimes 0.40%, 363 voters, and 0.68%, 440 voters. The contest between the state and the movement. The expectation of a moderately legitimate government was considerably undercut by the extent of the violence and the effectiveness of the boycott campaign. The election brought a new Congress-I government headed by Hiteshwar Saikia, an ethnic Assamese who is Ahom by caste. The choice of an Ahom as chief minister for the second consecutive time is significant, since there was a widespread perception that the Assam movement had its strongest support among ethnic Assamese upper castes. The new government's strategy of dealing with the movement combined political maneuvering with the use of coercion. It sought to wean support away from the Assam movement by allocating governmental patronage to groups that constitute the weak links in the Assamese ethnic coalition. The election violence had already strained the coalition. Ever since the election of Anwara Taimur as chief minister, there had been some signs that sections of ethnic Assamese Muslims might have had second thoughts about their participation in the movement. The large number of Muslim victims in the election violence and the national and international press coverage of it as a case of Muslims being killed strained the Assamese Muslim attitude towards the movement. By May 1983, there was an indication of a split in the AASU. At a secret conclave, several Muslim members of the AASU leadership issued an ultimatum to the AASU leadership demanding correction of a pro-Hindu communal tilt. Their memorandum demanded a firm definition of the word foreigner. The press gave some credit for the growing Hindu-Muslim rift in the ethnic Assamese coalition to the Saikia government. Rifts began to show in other weak links of the Assamese ethnic coalition as well. The election violence included some instances of conflict between ethnic Assamese opponents of the election and Plains tribal supporters. In the following months, important conferences of Plains tribals made demands that emphasized their distinctiveness from the ethnic Assamese, demands that smacked of a rebellion about the Assamese coalition. These demands included recognition of Bodo as an associate official language, the adoption of the Roman script instead of the Assamese script for writing, certain other tribal languages, and creation of autonomous districts and regions for the Plains tribals. The Saikia government probably played a significant role in these rifts. For instance, the government actively patronized the Bodo Sahitya Sabha and promoted it as a rival of the Assam Sahitya Sabha in Plains tribal areas. The annual session of the organization was attended by most members of the Saikia cabinet. By contrast, the declining share of government resources and patronage forced the Assam Sahitya Sabha to reconsider the involvement in the Assam movement. The leadership of the movement had to guard against the growing divisions in the movement. The election violence forced the leadership to suspend the movement and try to concentrate attention on healing the rifts in the Assamese coalition. In January 1984, the AASU held a national convention which was attended by a number of prominent Assamese intellectuals as well as movement activists in order to search for ways and means for regeneration of the Assamese nationality and to provide a united socio-cultural as well as political platform. The emphasis on unity was a recognition of the impact of the rift. At the second AASU convention in December 1984, the need to adapt to the ethnic diversity of the state dominated the discussions. The convention formed a committee to complete the process of political unification of the various ethnic groups of the Assamese people. There was discussion that stressed the need to include tea garden workers, Indian Nepalis, the tribal communities and the already assimilated religious minorities and also like-minded Indians in future protest actions. The Saikia government tried to compete for legitimacy with the Assam movement by emphasizing that the government, led by an ethnic Assamese, was serious about stopping future immigration and about removing the names of the post-1971 illegal aliens from the electoral rolls, on which there was an agreement between the movement leaders and the central government. Other measures aimed at redefining the policy agenda in order to wean support away from the movement included the carving out of new administrative districts and subdivisions and symbolic concessions to Assamese ethnic pride, such as changing the English spelling of the Assamese city from the anglicized Guwahati to the more Assamese Guwahati. The government secured popular support for some of these measures. For instance, the response to the call for strikes by the movement leaders to greet the inauguration of the headquarters of the new districts was weak even in the movement's strongholds. We should have ignored the move, said an AASU leader after the failure of their strike calls. How do you expect people in protest against a step that upgraded their small towns to district headquarters? Even though political maneuvering to break the Assamese coalition was a major part of the new government's strategy in dealing with the Assam movement, coercion also continued to play a major role. Journalists working for Assamese newspapers and magazines were the special targets of the new coercive measures. Many were arrested and beaten up in police lockups. The measures, however, failed to cut into the movement's popular base. During its 33-month rule, members of the Saikia cabinet were greeted by strikes and boycotts during their visits to ethnic Assamese areas. The sponsors of the movement refused to extend recognition to the Saikia government. The non-recognition was effective enough that when the central government decided to return to the negotiating table in the spring of 1984, it carefully left out the Saikia government, since its participation would have led the movement leaders to leave the talks. The agreement to dissolve the state assembly when the Assam Accord was signed was a concession to the movement's continued power capability. Accommodation. After 18 months negotiation between the Government of India and the movement leaders were initiated once again in April 1984. An accord was signed between Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and leaders of the Assam movement on August 15, 1985, India's Independence Day. According to the accord, illegal aliens who entered the state between January 1966 and March 1971 will be disenfranchised for 10 years, and those who came after March 1971 will be deported. The State Assembly elected in 1983, was dissolved and fresh elections based on the revised electoral rolls took place in December 1985. An amendment to India's citizenship law that was enacted by the Parliament in November 1985 stipulated that non-citizens who are found to have entered Assam between 1961 and 1971 will enjoy all rights of citizens except the right to vote for 10 years. The accommodation phase had begun in the middle of 1984. Several factors brought back an atmosphere of optimism about the prospects for a negotiated settlement. First, the central government recognized the movement's power capability by keeping the state government away from the negotiations. Second, administrative measures for revising electoral rolls based on earlier points of agreement, such as the disenfranchisement of post-1971 aliens, helped win the trust of the movement leadership. Third, even though the ice had been broken before the assassination of Indira Gandhi, the change of leadership in Delhi in late 1984 was a factor in the renewed goodwill between the centre and leaders of the movement. Election officials were increasingly taking the AASU into their confidence in the process of revising the rolls. By the end of 1984, there was a break between the AASU, which supported the administrative process of revising the electoral rolls, and one of the regional political parties behind the movement, which believed that the measures were unlikely to be effective. The AASU began to consider the formation of a new regional political party. Its second national convention in December 1984 emphasized the need to bring together different ethnic subgroups in the Assamese ethnic coalition under a common political platform. Once the accord was signed, the revision of electoral rolls was taken up even more earnestly. The procedures followed were controversial. Critics claimed that a large number of names of legal citizens were removed from the electoral rolls. The final electoral roll, on the basis of which the December election was contested, had 9,806,285 voters, 689,715 fewer than on the updated electoral roll of October 1984, which listed 10,496,000 voters. After the signing of the accord, two new parties emerged. The Assam Gana Parishad (AGP), formed by the student leaders of the Assam movement, and the United Minorities Front (UMF), formed by major East Bengali Hindu and Muslim politicians who had been members of the Congress I. If the implementation of the Assam Accord was the main issue for the AGP, the UMF demanded that the accord be scrapped. In the election, the AGP won 64 seats and 35.17% of the popular vote, followed by the Congress I with 25 seats and 23.43% of the popular vote, and the UMF with 17 seats and 11.09% of the votes. The election results allow some preliminary formulations on the pattern of ethnic voting. While the UMF hoped to bring all minorities, for example, immigrant Muslims, Bengali Hindus, Assamese Muslims, Nepalis and tribals within the framework, it did not do well except for some major concentrations of East Bengali Muslims. The UMF fared poorly in Hindu Bengali areas where most voters seem to have supported the Congress I. The AGP itself came much closer to grasping the imperatives of Assam's transformed demographic reality as it entered the electoral fray and used "minorities are not foreigners, AGP for all for AGP" as a major campaign slogan. The AGP came to power on a wave of popular support that was remarkably inclusive. Its appeal was not only to the ethnic Assamese but to many other ethnic subgroups. The AGP won in major plain tribal constituencies in the Kokrajhar district, the autonomous district of Karbi Anglong, and the plain tribal inhabited constituencies in the districts of Lakhimpur, Sonitpur and Darang. The AGP also won in constituencies that have major concentrations of tea plantation workers, mostly immigrants from Bihar, Orissa and Andhra Pradesh, and were traditional strongholds of the Congress I. The significant number of Muslims on the AGP's list of candidates suggests that the support for the Assam movement and the AGP among the Assamese Muslims, despite reversals during certain phases of the movement, remained quite high. Certain sections of Bengali Hindus and Bengali Muslims too appeared to have voted for the AGP. The AGP victory in the immigrant Bengali Muslim dominated Barpeta Assembly and parliamentary constituencies and the Nowgong parliamentary constituency supports this hypothesis. This is not surprising when one considers the likely effect of the accord on reconstituting the basis for political alignments on the part of East Bengali immigrants. Apart from the disenfranchisement of significant numbers of aliens, the accord also legitimized the citizenship status of a large number of immigrants. Those who came before 1966 and those who came between 1966 and 1971, who were to be legitimized in phases. The past tendency of East Bengali immigrant Muslims to vote as a bloc for the ruling party, which in that context was consistent with support for the ethnic Assamese project, was partly due to the insecurity that went with the legal ambiguity of their status, despite the inclusion of their names on the electoral rolls. To some extent, the basis for that insecurity and bloc voting for the ruling party was gone. An Indian reporter surmised that some immigrants, especially those surrounded by Assamese speaking inhabitants, voted for the AGP as a safe course. The support for the AGP among some sections of Bengali Muslims is also consistent with their support for ethnic Assamese causes in earlier controversies over cultural policy issues. The election results reflect ethnic polarization as well as new beginnings of ethnic accommodation. At one level, the emergence of two new regional political parties, one based primarily on the ethnic Assamese and the other on those threatened by the demands of the Assam movement, indicates significant ethnic polarization. However, the inclusive nature of the AGP support, in particular the ability to secure some support among Bengali Muslim immigrants and the somewhat limited nature of the UMF's support, indicate that the forces of polarization were mediated by the forces of accommodation. One of the most significant effects of the Assam movement is that the immigration issue has been put firmly on the public agenda. Earlier frameworks of ethnic accommodation attempted to obscure the immigration question. The AGP ministry with a new portfolio of accord implementation under the Chief Minister. It indicates the importance attached to the issue by supporters of the Assam movement and of the AGP. The issue has left the back rooms of political horse trading, and there is space for new innovations in dealing with the question. It is likely that electoral realities will bring about an approach to the problem that focuses more on stopping the future influx than on deporting those who are already there. New modes of incorporating illegal aliens, for example, the status of guest workers or of permanent residents, may be considered as options by a government that enjoys the trust of the ethnic Assamese on this question. However, the Assamese are unlikely to accept non-deportation of the post-1971 illegal aliens. Hence, deportation will be no easy task. The official position of the Bangladeshi government is that none of their citizens have illegally crossed the border into India. It is unlikely that the Indian government will risk deportation of its relations with Bangladesh and exacerbation of tensions between Hindus and Muslims in India by seeking to force the issue by the deportation of illegal aliens. There are already indications of opposition in Assam to efforts at soft pedaling the implementation of the accord. Nonetheless, since all ethnic subgroups in Assam do take the issue seriously, there is room for political resolution. The AGP leadership has shown signs of flexibility by acquiescing to a constitutional amendment introduced during the election campaign that allows disenfranchised non-citizens to continue enjoying all other rights of citizens. Some mix of resettlement of illegal aliens in the rest of the country and phased disenfranchisement in return for measures that will stop any future influx may be an acceptable compromise. The ability to evolve a new framework of ethnic accommodation will remain the key to political stability in Assam. In the course of the Assam movement, the leadership has learned that the road to cultural survival of the Assamese lies as much in an inclusive definition of Assamese-ness as in restricted numbers. If ethnic diversity has the potential to cause political turmoil in Assam, it also holds the possibility for political stability. Even though the old framework of ethnic accommodation broke down, the logic of electoral politics and the imperatives of ethnic diversity will continue to force contestants to search for ethnic accommodation. Thank you.